presentation. I am John Schlichting. I'm the president of the George Washington chapter of Lambda Alpha International. I want to thank our sponsors this morning. Our gold sponsors are AECOM and Silman, and our silver sponsors are Grove Slade, Partners for Economic Solutions, EHT Traceries, Lee and Associates, and Bonstra Hairsign Architects. Thank you all for your generosity. Last month, I announced the names of 14 new members. Those 14 members have now been confirmed. And we actually have 3 additional names to announce today of new members for a total of 17 new members for this year, which I think is pretty awesome, especially during the pandemic. Those 3 names are Cynthia Bailey Green, Kimberly Dayleader, and Jesse Ponce de Leon. So as we did last month, if anybody on the call today has any objections to any of these 3 becoming new members of Lambda Alpha International, please let us know, email Lisa or me or any of the board members by the end of the day on Friday, November 27th. We'd appreciate that. And thanks to our VP of membership, Jody Klein, for coordinating all that. I did want to mention, our executive director, Lisa Rother, asked me to mention that invoices for 2021 dues have been sent out to all existing members. The new members will get invoices separately, but the existing members got emails from Lambda Alpha International this week. The 2021 dues the total is $310, which consists of $160 that goes to International. International did not reduce their dues this year. And then the local chapter portion is $150 this year, which is down from $210. What we're assuming for 2021 is that we will not have any luncheons until September, but we are assuming that we will begin to gather together again in September. So our 2021 budget has 3 luncheons in there. So that would, your dues would go to those luncheons as well. Also wanted to mention that we actually have a new website that Lisa Rother has been working on. We got a grant from Lambda Alpha International that is going to help pay for this new website. It's been a long time coming, and got a huge thanks to Lisa, not only for coordinating the website, but also applying and getting that grant from International. So we're really excited about it. It will match up really nicely with the International website. And I think it'll be a lot more user-friendly. So excited about that. Finally, I wanted to announce that at the end of this presentation and questions and answers, we will have breakout rooms so that a smaller number of us can actually socialize. We're trying to at least try to replicate as much as possible the in-person interactions that we had when we were able to gather together in person. So stay tuned after the Q&A because Lisa will split everybody up and randomly, and we'll see who we end up at our table. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker today, who is Uwe Brandes. Brandes is the professor of the practice, faculty director of the Urban and Regional Planning Program, and faculty director of the Georgetown Global Cities Initiative at Georgetown University. Brandes is a distinguished scholar practitioner in the field of urban design and sustainable urban development, with more than 25 years of experience in the planning, design, and development of new buildings, the public realm, land use controls, and development partnerships. He serves as chair of the DC Commission on Climate Change and Resiliency. And without further ado, welcome, Uwe.
Thank you so much, John. This is such a treat. to be here with you today. I see many friends here, so I'm really excited to be here. I'm a faithful member of Lambda Alpha, and I'm an erratic participant. So it's wonderful to be here. I love coming to the meetings. I wish my track record was better than it has been in the last couple of years. I do want to just start off and single someone out, though, and extend a very heartfelt thanks to Lou Slade. I see you there, Lou. Lou's the reason why I got pulled into Lambda Alpha. It's really been a joy to be part of this organization for about 10 years now. And I think, Lou, you may remember when I joined about 10 years ago, that was the last time I gave a talk, and I gave a kind of a comprehensive history of the development process in the near Southeast, which we worked on together. And I remember that was a nice event and a really nice way for me to kind of reflect on my time working on the Anacostia Waterfront Initiative. Today, what I'm going to do is share some kind of preliminary findings. Really, it's a working presentation, and it's a project that we've been working on at Georgetown that looks at the role and really the framing of place management, what we're calling place management in the Washington region. And without further ado, let me see if I can share my screen. And I really look forward. I'm going to try to get through this presentation in about 20 or 25 minutes. And I'm really looking forward to conversation that we can have together after I'm done. If anyone wants to interrupt me during the presentation, please feel free. I look forward to the interaction here today. So what I'm presenting is something that we're calling the Place Leadership Project. And it is a research initiative that's really been ongoing for a couple of years now. And I'd like to formally acknowledge my other investigators that I've been collaborating with on this, who many, if not all of you know. And they are Rich Bradley and Ellen McCarthy, who've also joined the faculty of the Urban and Regional Planning program at Georgetown. And I also wanted to acknowledge Kevin O'Halloran, who is actually on the line here. He's joined us here today. Kevin has been the kind of project researcher and has really been the person who's done most of the work. Kevin, thank you. Your engagement in this has been really critical. And just as a little footnote, Kevin has just graduated from Georgetown, has a master's degree in urban planning, and he's out looking for a job. So if anybody's hiring, Kevin's a fantastic person to consider adding to your team. The Place Leadership Project is really kind of looking at what we're describing as place management, and I'll talk about that in a second. And it's looking at it in the context of the Washington region. So not just DC, but the whole region. And I think there's a couple of reasons why we're doing this. One is that the professional practices of place management are really a kind of a new form of urban planning and development and community development that really haven't, like we all know what it is, certainly us here in the region, but it hasn't really been codified as a professional practice in urban planning circles yet. There really are only a few graduate programs in urban planning that are teaching this, and we are one of them. But I am just so excited about this from a kind of professional practice perspective, because there's a level of professionalization going on in place management that is extremely exciting. So that's kind of one reason why we're interested in this. The second is, and this really goes without saying, but it's important for us in Washington to kind of remind ourselves that the very, very dynamic and civic conversation that we have about places in the Washington region is special. And not every city or every region has the level of intensity that we have in our region in thinking about the practices of place management and placemaking. And so we should be mindful of just how vibrant our professional community is in engaging in these conversations. And then thirdly, like so many other things, I think, and I've really come to think of this as very, very important for us here in Washington. While we go about solving our problems, we have many stakeholders across the country and indeed around the world looking over our shoulder to see how did they do it in Washington. And I've had the great fortune, and Lisa Rother knows this, when I was at ULI and I've continued while I was at Georgetown, I've had this great fortune of traveling and working with urban development officials and planners in many cities across the country and internationally. And I don't think we locally appreciate how much of an impact we're having on professional practice in other cities around the world. And so that was another reason for us to try to elevate this a little bit and say, hey, you know, yes, this is important professionally, and yes, we've got a lot going on in the Washington region. But the third pillar of this is, you know, how can we take the innovation that we're kind of all engaged in Washington and elevate it up and help other cities make progress in their work. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about this concept of place management and what a place management organization is. We'll talk about the project. We'll do a scan of these organizations across the metropolitan region. Talk a little bit about the existing literature associated with place management organizations. And then talk about these first steps that we've taken in trying to research here in the region, and then end on a note around data and reporting. So PMO, this is not a term of art yet, but we are trying to advance it as one. And there are, of course, many kinds of organizations that could fit into this, but we traditionally refer to them as a description of their funding model. And so the easiest is, and the two most prevalent are when we talk about bids or we talk about main streets. And what we're suggesting is that there's a set of professional practices that constitute the composition of a place management organization that is important irrespective of the funding model that supports that organization. And I'll talk about that more in greater detail. Just as we start, though, I think this, and everybody on the call knows this, the issue of place, it always has been important to us when we're thinking about cities, but it is codified in the New Urban Agenda. There was a very vibrant conversation during the time in which the new urban agenda was being drafted, to make sure that place is explicitly acknowledged and championed and really celebrated in the kind of global framework of thinking about cities. And, you know, there has been some lots of discussion and some things written about this idea of a fourth level of urban governance. We put the ANCs in a dotted line just because we know them well in DC, but they're not always, it's very unusual that other cities would have that level of governance. And these place management organizations are taking on some responsibilities of governance. And at times they are an extension of government, and at times they're not. The second kind of point here about governance is that there's this interesting relationship between the delivery of services and the structure of governance. And I think that's something that is quite out of focus. There's a lot of confusion about the two, and that's something that we think is really interesting and important to discuss. And then, as I'm sure everyone on the in the meeting here today knows, these organizations have, especially those that are more closely associated with business improvement districts, have typically provided, you know, these services listed here, and we kind of know them as organizations who deliver these kinds of services. But increasingly, we see a lot of diversification in terms of what the actual services, contemporary services, are. As I mentioned before, I do think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, this local conversation that we're having about these types of organizations is a conversation that's happening in many other international markets as well. All of these countries have some form of place management or bid legislation in place with many different organizations in key cities. I know from my own personal experience that in Germany and Japan, these organizations have really been important in performing the very similar functions that we've created them for in our region, that is to revitalize downtowns, to think about downtown locations in a bigger and larger frame than just business hours. And if you look domestically now, we've just pulled some easy stats here. There are about 1,600 Main Street organizations across the country, 560 downtown organizations, and the International Downtown Association, which is really such an important organization in this conversation, has estimated a year ago that there's about 2,500 of these organizations, of place management organizations across the country. So, we're not having this dialogue in DC and in the Washington region in a vacuum, although the argument that I'm going to try to make is that in many respects, we are a very important innovator. So I wanted to acknowledge we've formed a place research collaborative, and I wanted to just acknowledge some of our partner institutions that are involved in this. Many of you know Chris Lineberger at GW, and I'm going to be talking about his work in just a second. Of course, we have the Urban Land Institute and ULI under Lisa's leadership, I believe, created a dedicated working group on place making, which is really exciting. Importantly, there is a new research group at Brookings that is just focused on place. Jennifer Vey is leading that. Very exciting to see Brookings entering into the conversation at this scale of policymaking. I mentioned IDA and APA, and everyone knows PPS as well. The manner in which we've been organizing this research has really been community-based and participatory. We've conducted a lot of roundtables and focus groups and so forth at our campus at Georgetown. We've created and tried to identify each of the organizations. I'll be talking about that some more. And from time to time, we've been bringing in people outside of the Washington region to help us think about these issues as well. Okay, so let's take a look at the landscape. We believe there are 150 regionally significant place management organizations in the DC metro area. And we are intentionally broadening the typologies, the organizational typologies that we consider to be a place management organization, primarily because we see so much innovation occurring in the manner in which these organizations engage their urban stakeholders. And some of these, of course, are very predictable, the business improvement districts, the main streets. But there are important civic partnerships that have been formalized across the region. I'll talk about more in a second. Public-private partnership development projects that we're calling P4s. And as I think everybody can appreciate, there are several regionally significant private urban places across the region, universities, federal government districts that are large enough to be really thought of as being an urban district. And then we have got two typologies that we're kind of including here, but with an asterisk. And one is really the kind of legacy of community development corporations, many of which have not stood the test of time, but some of which have, and so we've kind of singled them out. And then finally, and this may seem a bit further afield, but we do believe that some of the large parks have a special role to play in this conversation. So these are just the typologies that we've identified as entities that should be considered to be place management organizations. And this is just a partial, this is just an illustration. This is just a partial representation of these 150 entities. But I think it's really, I love the slide because to me, it really does signify the kind of vitality and intentionality that these organizations bring to their work. Some of these organizations we know well. Some are still under the radar screen, but they're all bringing a level of intentionality to the places that they manage that is really exciting from our perspective. And I think one of the kind of big ideas that we're interested in exploring is how the collection of these organizations are truly shaping our region. So this is no longer, just the downtown DC bid working on downtown. This is now a whole network of different organizations doing very similar things in their own unique way and truly transforming our region. Transforming it in terms of the quality of life, certainly at the vanguard of economic development. And so often now, in such exciting ways, thinking about how our built spaces can be humanized, can be made more livable through the advancement of culture and special events. And importantly, and we're going to drill down into this in a few slides, these organizations are not only, I mean, we can anecdotally observe that they're making huge impact. In fact, many of us as individuals know that they're making an impact because we benefit from it. But these organizations sometimes are also exercising intentionality around documenting their performance and impact. And this is a point that we'll come to at the end of this presentation that I think really deserves a lot of additional conversation. But the important thing is that these organizations really are doing exciting things. And many times they're trying to document that and thinking about, as individual organizations, thinking about how to document their impact and how to understand the performance, the kind of cumulative performance of their urban places. So we'll come back to this. So what I want to do now is just kind of build up a kind of a regional analysis of where these organizations are and kind of explore some of their characteristics. And I'm starting here with a map that I'm sure everybody knows well. And this is the Council of Governments map of the activity centers across the MPO. And there are 141 listed. I do think that this is a really great point of departure to think about, those important civic centers across the region that are key, and that COG also, has identified for us as being key towards the delivery of public policy goals. And these are very varied places. Many of them are, of course, located immediately adjacent to transit. I do think, and this is part of a, much bigger conversation that many of us, or all of us really are having. It's weighted towards the west of the region and the north of the region. But I think, thinking about where these activity centers are and what role they play in the growth of the region is, the conversation that we have nearly every day. Building on COG's mapping of the activity center is the very important work that Chris Leinberger has been doing. Chris coined this term walk-ups, the walkable urban places. Chris's main focus has been on the economic analysis of existing urban places. And he's identified these 43 as regionally significant. And I think that's a really important touchstone, kind of a market touchstone that complements the many that the COG has identified. What we're going to do here in these next couple of slides is try to thread the needle and identify additional locations beyond these 43 that have expressed intentionality through new forms of governance. And so they may not be functioning at a high level the way that Chris describes these areas, but they have signaled their intent to become regionally significant places in Washington. Okay, so here's just a kind of a buildup. So here we have the activity centers. And we start with mapping what we're describing as the private urban places and for the most part, large master developed sites that are subject of major public-private partnership agreements. And then we build onto that a series of very important civic partnerships. I think the favorite one that we all love to point to is the Tyson's Partnership. And these are locations where landowners have gotten together to really begin to coordinate their actions in a very significant way. We have the universities, many of which have very, even if it's not declared as an urban district, they have very intense stakeholder engagement strategies. And then you add on to this kind of finer scale of the Main Street programs. The Main Street program the Main Streets are definitely concentrated within the District of Columbia. There is an important one in Manassas. And so this is at a kind of a smaller scale. And then of course you have the business improvement districts. And then the great parks. And then we've also kind of, in addition to just identifying the great parks, we've overlaid the regional trail systems onto this map, just to kind of begin to look at a composite representation of these different areas of special PMO governance. So what do we know about these organizations? So this is, if you accept our kind of typology, our definition of typologies, here's a kind of breakdown across the region. And it's kind of interesting. It's really kind of very diverse, as we would expect. And while there are many, again, that we know well, there are lots of these other organizations that are regionally significant. If you look at the kind of at the jurisdictional distribution, we see that for sure there's a concentration of bids in the district. We know that there's an overwhelming concentration of main streets in the district, and that's because the district's created a very impressive main streets program. We see the partnerships tend to be located more in Maryland and Virginia. I think the private urban places are concentrated in Maryland and Virginia, primarily because we're including the very large shopping malls in that definition. The public-private partnership places are really these kind of large public-private joint development projects, many in the district, university and government kind of distributed, as well as the parks. And when we look at these, again, just kind of this broad brushstroke, when we look at these organizations, there's really a very wide variety and really diversity in both the capacity that they bring to their work and also their scale. And this is just an illustration just to demonstrate that, you know, some of these organizations are relatively small and have low capacity, but they're demonstrating this intentionality that we think is very, very important. And then I think, you know, it's very clear from our work, and it comes at no surprise, should become as no surprise to anyone, that one of the largest and certainly the most, the organization with the most capacity is the downtown DC Business Improvement District. So that's obvious. Now, when we look at these organizations and start to try to analyze their reporting practices, we see some variance. And so if we start at the top here, if you look at the business, just at the business improvement districts, about 3/4 of them are producing an annual report, very transparent. Obviously, they're having, you know, important meetings to celebrate their annual progress, and we know this to be very familiar to all of us. There are a couple that are reporting through either their website or through a performance plan, and one that's not reporting at all. If we go down to the lower right, we see on the civic partnership side, less emphasis on reporting. Some are reporting just through their website. Some it's hard to find any of their performance data. And if you look at the lower left, there is in the world of main streets, there's good reporting, either through a reporter or website, but then many who are just not at that level of capacity yet to aggregate data and present it to the public. So when we think about reporting, there are many opportunities that we believe lie before us. I think there's an importance in thinking about even what the reporting objectives are. So why should these organizations be reporting? What is the really purpose of reporting and providing data feedback to the broader public? For sure, there's a need to explore more standardization in the reporting of these organizations. It is tempting to want to create as much standardization as possible in order to be able to enter into like-for-like comparisons. I think that also comes with some risk because none of us want to create a homogenized region with homogenized civic centers. Each one is very different from the next, certainly in terms of their urban context and cultural context. But right now it's very difficult to compare one to another. And there is a important conversation to be had around the normalization of data collection, and lots of important work that needs to be done there. The flip side to the kind of a world of perfect and transparent reporting is the very real capacity challenge that organizations have in marshaling research, in marshaling data to even be able to report at all. So we think there's a important need to think about minimum thresholds for reporting. We all want perfection, but we should also think about kind of a lower bar of what is the minimum kind of data that we want these organizations to produce in order to understand their role in our communities. And I think a big part of that conversation is the need to define metrics that have traditionally been missing from the reporting on place performance. And some of these, of course, are environmental, social, and health. I mean, the conversation that we're all engaged in now with respect to social equity in the region is place-based. And so many of the organizations today are just not reporting on that at all. So as we've started this process, we've asked some questions that we hope to be able to answer ourselves. And so the first is we're kind of interested in what those current reporting practices are. Then secondly, we've done a scan of other globally available measurement regimes that could be used to help evaluate place management organizations. And then, this point that I just made, given the administrative capacity of existing PMOs, what might constitute a first generation of minimum reporting? So we're going to start. I just want to quickly start with what I think is to be a very important observation, and that is if you look at the existing academic literature that's overwhelmingly focused on business improvement districts, I can assure you that it is grim, absolutely grim. There are very few academics, maybe with the exception of Chris Lineberger, that have really seen business improvement districts as a transformative, kind of pro-urban, pro-city building and pro-community building vehicle. And much of the literature has really focused on this issue of the split incentive challenge that these organizations have in governance, right? So that, the boards are comprised of largely landowners, that the diversity of place-based and community-based stakeholders are not represented in the governance, and there's a kind of a clear body of academic research that has really begun to blame bids as the genesis of gentrification and displacement, and et cetera, et cetera. Famously, work that's been done in New York to accuse bids as being the driver of the kind of suburbanization of Manhattan. What the existing literature really is missing from our perspective is the value that these organizations are creating with respect to the formation of urban networks and the kinds of community development practices that are part of community building. And so there's value there, we believe, that the existing academic literature is not covering. In general, I would say, just a last point on the existing academic literature, there is a body of literature, but it's not huge. So I still think we're in the first innings of trying to understand the specific role and power of place management. There are, of course, many other sources of literature that we've been looking at, the actual reports that the organizations produce themselves. So we've collected many of those, not just from the Washington region, but from other important cities. And I think this goes without saying, although for our purposes, it's interesting to be explicit about this, and that is that the professional associations, most importantly IDA, but then also the Urban Land Institute, have played an incredibly important role in information dissemination and in the kind of formation of the professional practice within this area. We talked about government before. We do believe that Chris's work is very important, and he's, of course, for people who know Chris, he's been working not just in our region, but in many cities across the U.S. and internationally in advancing this idea of, kind of an economically justified walkable urban place. And then we've spent a lot of time actually recently looking at the certification systems, and I'm going to share a few slides on this, but these certification systems are really interesting. It's been a very vibrant decade of coming up with different certification systems. Let me just kind of jump into that next. So there are lots of different initiatives to create metrics to evaluate, the performance of urban places and urban districts. And what I'm going to do now is kind of go into some of these, into our analysis of these. So we believe that there's at least 20 important certification or performance measurement frameworks that exist already. Some have been, very organized and orchestrated on kind of a national level. And we kind of point to the United States Green Building Council as being very important actually in trying to come up with national standards and indeed international standards of place-based evaluation. But importantly, there's a tremendous amount of innovation that's been going on within individual bids. And so some of these annual reports that have been produced are really like incredibly sophisticated. And certainly we would count the downtown DC bid in that very select group of individual place-based organizations that have kind of defined their performance themselves through kind of an ongoing and iterative set of practices. But when you take a huge step back from all of these different frameworks, we've come up with a primary finding, and this really doesn't come as a surprise, but we're trying to articulate this a little bit more, and that is that you have two cultures when looking at place-based performance in cities. The first is what we're calling the set designers that are really very focused on the performance of the physical built environment itself. And then we have the second culture that we're kind of playfully calling the film producers, which are looking to evaluate the kind of economic and community performance of these places. And so we'll just kind of drill down into this a little bit more. So this idea of two cultures of measurement. And just using this illustrative example of the wharf, on the one hand, you know, there's several measurement regimes that really try to codify the built environment in a way that is foundational to its performance. And on the other hand, you have, you know, community-based and in some respects kind of more culturally oriented frameworks of measurement that are trying to understand, you know, how humans really use the place and kind of exploring how, you know, what value that has. So again, this is kind of broad brushstroke here, but you know, we've kind of put the set designers on the one side and the film producers on the other, and you can see that you know, they really are two different worlds of thinking, and I really do want to emphasize that while there's been a lot of very institutionally supported work on the set design kind of typology of measurement, there's been a lot of on-ground innovation on the kind of producer side, and I'll explain that in a second. So on the kind of physical environment side of things, and of course, you know, urban design and building efficiencies, the things that we kind of think about as being related to the green building movement, focusing on environmental quality, and getting into even some areas of human health and food systems. Whereas on the film producer side, there's really a focus on kind of safety and perception, really kind of leading back to the original kind of ideas of placemaking. And obviously a huge focus on the occupancy of buildings, you know, whether a district is being fully occupied or not, and the real estate metrics that go along with that. And also, I think very important, an emphasis on transportation performance from the perspective of access as related to, you know, the vitality of the market economics of a place as supported by transportation systems. And really important emphasis on culture and communications, you know, numbers of people visiting, cultural events, you know, these are kind of what the set designers may think is more ephemeral. And then one very important difference between the two is that the film producers also self-assess their own organizational capacity, you know, how big their budgets are, how many staff they have, that sort of thing, which really doesn't show up at all in the other. And so if we take these, there are areas of common overlap, and I think the three that we think are most important are urban design, that everyone can acknowledge is incredibly important, and the way in which urban design supports a mixture of uses. Transportation, you know, great emphasis on in both cultures, and economic valuation, although the way in which economic valuation is measured very different between the two, but there's a common overlap in that emphasis. So these are just a couple of representative slides that show some of our analyses of these metrics, and looks at, we've basically done a meta-analysis of all the metrics and together, and just to illustrate, you know, where the emphasis lies. And I'm just going to go through these very quickly. Yes.
Great. I hope you're getting ready to wrap up soon. So
I know, I am. I just have a couple more slides. I'm going to go through these very quickly. I just see.
Perfect.
Yeah. So I'm just going to end here with a couple of slides. We need to figure out the critical importance of empowering professional practice of measurement. I think that's the bottom line here. There's more work necessary to figure out how to do that. We need to expand these metrics to include health and social inclusion, equity, and importantly, to think about urban places across a whole variety of demographics. The reporting, the pressures on reporting are only growing, and so how place reporting and place performance fit into other policy reporting and other market-based reporting regimes across different scales, I think is an important linkage. And I will just echo, I'm going to go through this. I'm not going to go through this because this just emphasizes the points that we've already made. And this is my last slide here. We do think that there needs to be kind of new framing, hopefully at least a semi-standardized methodology that allows for these kinds of organizations to better assess what their impact is. And we're definitely underscoring the need to explore health and social equity measures in addition to the good measures that have already been identified in all of their work. And my goodness, I cannot believe the time has flied in the way it has. I'm so sorry for going over. I had not wanted to go this long, but I'm going to stop here and just thank everyone for your attention today and for the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.
It's great. Thank you. I see a question in the chat already from David Harrisine about biophilic cities.
I think that's a great question. And, you know, I guess my response to that is I do think that we're in this tremendous reassessment of the relationship between the built environment and the natural environment, and the opportunity to provide direct experiential access to nature is something that is no longer something we do outside of cities, but inside cities. And so for sure, I think this is critically important. And I think this is reflected in the placemaking dialogues emphasis on parks and access to open space. So absolutely.
If there are other questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask the question to Uwe. With all that information, there must be lots of questions, or you can write it in the chat.
I'll ask you one, Uwe. It's John Fitch.
Hi, John.
Hi. So there are services that PMOs provide that one could imagine. I mean, in some ways, like healthcare. You know, there are services that in some cultures are considered it's just something the public does, and I think that would you say that much of the work that these PMOs do are considered just part and parcel of what the community does for itself in European cultures, for example, or is that not, are these services simply not in public budgets anywhere anymore?
John, I think it's a great question, and I'd actually like to broaden it. I think in order to answer that question, you really have to think about, well, gosh, what kind of economic development strategies do we have in place in the first place? And I think this is, one of the byproducts, I think, of our COVID period now is going to be that, we're really asking many more questions about how places support small businesses. But I'd connect that to your question in the sense that, what kind of economic diversity do we want in places? Interestingly, Jane Jacobs talks about this, 50 years ago about the importance of having a diverse economy in single places. It's not just about, the amount of, international commercial real estate capital that's attracted to a place, right? I mean, it's really about the kinds of activities and the kinds of economies that are created in the place. And I don't think we have those measurements.
Are bids even interested in that kind of diversity?
Really? I think there's a lot of interest in that, especially right now, given the challenges that we have with respect to small businesses and especially small business retail. And I mean, just even if you think about the kind of enormous revolution that we're in and thinking about food economies and what we want restaurants to be, there's tremendous attention to this, but I just don't think we're measuring that.
It's not just a matter of dollars per square foot, you don't think?
I certainly don't know, because I think when we start thinking about equity issues, and I think this has been the largest source of critique of these kinds of organizations so far, is that they have not been sensitive to these issues, and they have been a force of economic displacement, which I think is a valid criticism, but I also don't think that that a diverse economy is just going to appear on its own. I mean, I certainly believe that we need to create new economic development strategies to achieve that. So whether it's healthcare or whether it's other the kind of formation of capital and wealth across local stakeholder groups, these are things that need to be measured and managed. Hi, Lou.
Hi. Thank you for all this. My mind is spinning because this is not an area that I was very involved in any way in my profession. But I live in Chevy Chase, DC. We have a upcoming small area plan exercise that's going to take place. And the conversation today made me think about a lot of factors here. One is has to do with the placement of different individual businesses physically within these centers of activity. As we all know, shopping center developers would place stores within their shopping centers in ways that made them more vibrant. And if you were a uninteresting shop, you couldn't get mainline location. You were around the corner near the bathrooms or something like that. I even worked on a project, City Center here in DC, where a British firm that does consulting had a computer model which would analyze the views from every location within the space of City Center, the retail space of City Center, if you know that network. And what you could see from different locations within the space. It made me think about my 4-block business district right here, where the chains get the best sites because they can pay the rent, and the mom and pop shops, which are the more interesting places, are around the corners. Could you turn your mute on, please? So, you know, if you drive down the street, 50,000 cars a day go by this little shopping district we have, and all they see is nail salons and banks. But if you go around the corner, you find a wonderful card shop, and you find a wonderful antique shop, and you find a wonderful clothing store and a children's store and so forth. I guess after saying all that, I have a question, which is, have you ever seen a traditional shopping area within one of these places where the properties are owned by individuals? You know, we always say everybody that owns these buildings here live in Florida, and they just collect the rent. They don't care who the tenant is as long as they pay the rent. Where there's some influence on the design of the place, on the placement of different opportunities for different retail and different services and so forth. Because it seems to me it's a very big factor. We have a friend right now who has a very successful store in DuPont Circle area, and there's a Starbucks that may move away, may close down. She's fighting that desperately because that Starbucks, in her view, is a big factor for her business, which is a clothing business. So, you know, this is, I'm getting down to a level of detail and management and government interference that, you know, probably is not allowed in our world in America, but it's a big factor.
Yeah, no, Lou, I think it's really interesting, and it is. I think we're looking at new value propositions about creating economies that transcend individual property ownership, and I think that raises a lot of kind of unusual and in some cases uncomfortable questions around agency of who, you know, who's really in charge, who gets to decide. Just a couple of things that you remind me of. One is when I was at the Urban Land Institute, we did a national advisory panel on Nantucket, because in Old Town Nantucket, there are no locally serving businesses that can survive in the tourist economy of Nantucket. And so there was a kind of a need to think of a kind of an economic governance system that would allow for locally serving retail to exist there, because, you know, the market wouldn't support them otherwise, because, you know, the kind of peak of summer commerce in Nantucket. And then I also think of, you know, we have tried to deal with some of these things through zoning in DC. And I think of Cleveland Park, and I know there's some zoning set-asides for certain kinds of retail there. So we're trying, but I think what I think is really important, and I think is increasingly kind of like a hallmark of our region, is that we have extremely sophisticated real estate professionals who are also thinking about this, and who are taking the, like, you know, very refined and sophisticated strategies of retail, of single owner retail, like i.e. shopping malls, right? into a more of a civic and public realm conversation. And it's hard to know exactly where this is going. But I think one of the reasons why we think this is an important conversation is that it is these place management organizations that seem to be at the nexus of these kinds of conversations. And it's hard to predict exactly how public policy is going to intersect with that. But, you know, whether it's, I mean, we can point to Georgetown, or we can, you know, point to so many different places where, you know, the markets have been overrun in some respects, and are no longer locally serving. And, you know, I think this is the conversation, and I don't think that either the practices nor the strategies are necessarily clear.
Bethesda Row is a good example. I think Federal Realty just bought up the whole block there. But it's survived for probably 20 years now, and still there's no dark windows on Bethesda Row.
Right. But how I think there is a, I mean, what's really exciting about this, I think, is that there is a higher level conversation about almost kind of the curation of local economies that, you know, people really value. And everybody on this call knows that this kind of conversations that we have about authentic uses. You know, I think the whole food revolution in DC has played a huge role in making us think about what value is. And of course, we've seen so many, you know, really progressive property owners make very careful choices about the kinds of uses that they incorporate into their projects. I guess what we see as the next kind of dimension of this is really thinking about this as on an urban district level, right? Where specific choices are made, and potentially, and you know, I think we're just at the beginning of this, although COVID, I think, accelerates this, potentially thinking about new ways of either cross-subsidizing or just outright subsidizing local uses.
What ran through my mind when you started to give your talk was, you know, the role of great spaces rubbing shoulders together at all income levels. And I'm thinking that with the COVID, with people being concerned, the role of outdoor spaces, and the fact that for the lower income people, I mean, this is a huge opportunity to rethink the kind of activity mix you want to have. It'll play an even more important role, outdoor spaces, be more attractive to people, particularly if they don't have money to spend on, you know, more higher end entertainment activities. So I think there's a wonderful opportunity here to broaden the thinking about how we create spaces and what we want to do, mixing people together.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think this is where we really shine, where these organizations, if you look at their activities across the region, even in the kind of exurbs, you know, that you wouldn't really think of as kind of an exciting civic destination, there are just so many creative initiatives to bring people together. And as I said, you know, this is very underappreciated in the research literature, and at the same time, it represents the kind of lived reality that we all share in this region.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more comments or questions? Thank you so much, Uwe. That was fascinating. It's good to have people thinking about these things so that we can benefit from all the work that you've done and will continue to do.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to come back and maybe in a more time efficient way update the Lambda Alpha on our ongoing findings.
That'd be great.
That would be awesome. And this is the time when you typically get a huge round of applause, Uwe. So consider that done.
Thanks. Well, again, my apologies for going over. I had no idea it was going to take that long.
Well, thank you again for a really thought-provoking presentation. For the membership, our next presentation in lieu of a lunch will be on December 18th. We're going to have Vicki Davis of Urban Atlantic talk to us about both the Walter Reed and the New Carrollton projects. And thank you to Emily Ige for arranging that. And with that, are we still going to do any breakout groups, Lisa?
Sure, if anyone wants to join us, I'll set it up, and please stay around and join a room. I'll do that right now, okay? Thanks, everyone.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Hello. Emily?
Hey, how are you? Whoops, you're on mute.
People just left. That's okay.
Oh my God, Lisa.
I just need to stop recording.
Oh my gosh.